My name is Silvana Omega. I'm Director of Research and Politics at ILDA. We are legally based in Uruguay, but our remote team, well, some of our members are here. We're based in different places in Latin America. I'm here with two people with whom we've been working and plotting and planning for several months, Catherine Ignacio and Elena Suarez Val. And we began this, at first it was a very small project. We were just debating some things about how to think about a community of people interested in feminicide data. And at first it was something more like a panel, a small talk. Eventually it became this series of events, webinars, workshops, interactive sessions that we will carry out throughout this month in 3 languages with lots of people coming, great panelists, speakers, and of course all of you joining us there to participate in these talks. So this was a very humble plan, but now it became something huge, and we hope that it will be useful for everyone, because basically our goal is to foster conversation, to create a community of practice, to make visible all the people who work in this issue. Elena is going to tell you the details now of the activities, but I would like to formally mention, introduce those who are collaborating and making this possible. First of all, as I said, my 2 partners in crime, Catherine Ignacio from Data Plus Feminism Lab from MIT, and her team of students who are supporting us and working very hard on our projects that she's leading, Elena Suarez Val, and her project Feminicide Uruguay, which has been for a few years recording, gathering data of feminicide in Uruguay with great effort and dedication. It's a personal project. And then we would like to thank all of those who are joining us from, well, government, journalism, the academy, and civil society. I would like to thank the interpreters, which you're going to be hearing if you choose the Portuguese or the English channels. I also wanted to thank Sofia Donner, who's going to be recording these events and preparing infographics. You're going to know more about her work on our final event, where she's going to show us everything that she has produced throughout these meetings. Maria Esther Cervantes, Tete as we call her, and Ana Sofia Ruiz from ILDA, who always support me in all these plans, and Judith for all her support in communications. We also want to thank for each of the projects that we are working with, IDRC and MIT and IDB. And I also wanted to tell you, now that I have the slide there, we have hashtags in case you want to tweet things about this meeting. This is a relatively formal event. You can mention on social media what everyone is saying, because we have, basically it's just presentations, so you have a hashtags there if you want to use them and make visible, give visibility to what we're doing now. And now we're going to begin. I'm going to present our moderator. I would like to present her. She's Ángeles Martínez Cuba from MIT. She's going to be helping us moderating these two sessions.
Well, good morning, everyone. Welcome to this great event. Let's begin with the first block. Silvana will begin the first presentation. Dr. Fumega is currently Research and Policy Director of Latin American Initiative for Open Data. She is also working in the University of Tasmania in New Zealand. She is in the University of Buenos Aires for Political Science University. She is also participating in the University of Wellington. She has been a consultant for different organizations at international level and social society. She has been a counselor for different international organizations, as well as the civil society. In the last years, she has focused on the relation between data and reality. She has presented our work on the data and the standardization of data in feminicide in Latin America. Silvana, please. As usually happens in these cases, I can't find where I have the other presentation. Just wait a moment, please. Here it is. Let me share the screen here. Just in case I'm talking again. Later, other people will talk with interesting topics on this matter. First, as I said before, I work in ILDA. It's an organization, an association, a civil organization with legal base in Uruguay, but we have a team, a remote team. I have mentioned some of them, and we are working mainly on the idea of creating and generating solutions for these kind of problems in Latin American based on the ethical usage of data. All our work is within the framework of this idea. Know who we are, where we are, what we do. So every time we have to make a decision, we have to think about something, an action or a project, we do it within this idea. The idea of belonging to something, of thinking which are the problems, and contribute with our small part. Briefly, just for you to know from where I'm talking, in the last 3 years, we have 4 lines of work, and this strategy ends by the end of the year, and we will bring another one, but basically, the first one is efficiency, transparency in the public sector. Second, strengthening of the Latin American data society. Third, ethics in development of emerging technologies. And the fourth, the one that I will deal today, is data for the participation, equally and participation. So in this last line, we started over 3 years ago. I'm saying 3 years, and it's been a long time now when I say it out loud. We started within several ideas, talking about data in the region. Basically, why we do this, I'm going to use the idea of another colleague, Fasha, who also works with us in this project, and is key to develop it. She also says when we have a workshop, we have to say, which is the importance of this. Many of you may know it because you are in the subject. We are talking about feminicides and data. You have to deal with the people there. You know what happens in between all the things. We have to say how we think. Think about an apple. If I ask you, what do you think about? You say, the first thing you say is, it's a fruit. We agree on that? So, but the problem appears when I start asking about the features. Each of you will say, depending on your background or where you live, will give a different answer. Some about the color, green, sour, sweet, red. The same happens what we came through with these definitions of the legal definitions of feminicide in the region. So I'm going to show you just as an example. It's hard to read it on the screen, but so you have here an example of what I saw saying how the different countries define the crimes committed by their couples in the marriage, outside the marriage, close relatives. In Colombia, other things, in other countries, you have a broader definition, and enlarges the kind of people that the victim was acquainted with, the relationship, how close they were. So you have Panama, Mexico, Honduras, and so on. The question is, just give me a moment because I'm doing sharing screen, talking. It's kind of difficult. Please understand, be patient. As you can see in the screen, one of the main topics in most laws, judicial systems convey about the subject, one of the most common categories to collect data is as regards the couple relationship. So it's intimate environment. Everything that it leaves out when it only collect data as the intimate feminicide. Then you have many other variables that are very detailed, and we are not even including all the modalities, all the ways. In this sense, what this causes is a collection, a registry of cases, not all of them that could be classified as it. Not all of them are included in this classification. This way, what happens when we are thinking about this, and this is just a rough number, the one that the CEPAL has recorded, you have 20,365 women that have been violently killed because of their gender. But when you go deeper into that number, you have a large number of victims. We go back to what we said before, the place where you have a greater coincidence of the intimate femicide, you have 841 cases. If you add all the other categories that we saw in the other screen, you have a larger number, and you have a large number of victims that are not included in this. You have 841, 2,950. So all these exercises in the region have been very useful, are enabling us to talk about these subjects, but they have their own limitations. They don't include other victims that are not recorded, and therefore they are not visible. So, as I said, this introduction as to why, and again, perhaps it's not even necessary because most of you know what I'm talking about. This is how to tell you how the project began. So in 2017, as an organization, our core is on data management, how we could do with that, how we could contribute to this situation, in something that we consider essential in Latin America. We had some meetings in April 2017 in Mexico with some experts on the subject, and then we decided and understood that we needed more people, more professionals from different countries and different specialities, lines of work, because there is an intersection of different specialities, gender, health, psychology from different countries. So we had a workshop, a 2-day workshop. Some of you may have participated in this workshop. And what we wanted to know, if it had any sense, what we were thinking about, a subject that we had to carry on. And what we found a great agreement, and there was a minimum set of data that were standardized. We made a first research to understand what we were doing, what we were talking about. Just a brief clarification. We have to differentiate about this standardization. Why we talk about the standardization and not any other kind of exercise? Basically, because we believe that standard process, our hypothesis for work is that to strengthen the structure and data management, data are structured, and this is an essential requirement, but they are not enough. We are quite aware of all this, and this enables what we were trying to do is to have official records, official data, to have. So this standardization process is that organizations are more aware of the data that they recollect, how they do it, where they gather them, how they communicate this information. So a standard, a process for the standardization is not only a technical process, but also to think over as an organization what we do with all this data. It can be feminicide or any other subject. What we conclude is that these kind of processes are producing small transformations within the public organizations, and at the same time help to support the construction of these kind of processes and exercises by incorporating other points of views, not only the point of view of the organization that is managing the data, but also other organizations like ourselves and other ones that are participating or have participated in the design of the standard. I want to hurry up, so I don't use much time of other people. We developed the first standard. Gabriela Rodriguez undertook this. There was a huge work to do this. I carried out the first schedule of this, and we needed the feedback again of everyone that participated in the workshop and the expanded community. And that is very important to us because all this exercise must be done in group with participation of all the points of view that as may be necessary for the process. So with this, we had 2 pilot programs in Mendoza and in Montevideo, Mendoza, Argentina, and Montevideo, Uruguay. And one of the first things that we saw, perhaps that we hadn't thought before, is about the need to have a protocol for the process, to tell these things. It's common sense, but what do we tell when we are telling? In these things, these are very handcraft activity. This is in your head, in the process, but if that person leaves the position, so the process is not registered in writing anywhere. So if the person leaves the organization, the process is affected. Therefore, with all these things that we learned in the first workshops, the protocol and the data standard, we began a second stage where, with the support of the IBD, we worked with Panama, Paraguay, and more recently with these 2 last countries. Basically, what we carried out was to think over of what we then make a new version with everything we learned, not only with the process, but also with the workshops in Uruguay and Argentina. And we approach each of the countries, first like exploring in each of them, and then with workshops, first last year in presence, but this year we had to adapt ourselves to this new situation and made them virtually, remotely, and we continued to see what was happening. And we were surprised that in Panama and Ecuador, what they are doing there is quite encouraging, and the process that they have been carried out from before with data recollection. Paraguay is newer, but they are also starting to work in this. So basically, I would like to conclude. So even though nobody rang the bell that my time is running out. So let's conclude. Okay, this is the last slide. So basically, I would like to share some visions of what we did in the last 3 years, especially, firstly and mainly, the importance of having institutional mechanisms that enable the institutions to have this data available at different access levels. But you have a connection between all the units that form part of the processes, and enable also to have one person that is the voice, the speaker for all this data. Yeah? To have one speaker in each of the countries. This seems to be common sense, but when you get to see what is happening, sometimes the reality is not this, especially with public institutions, especially having a speaker for all the official data. What we also realized is the need to increase training for gender perspective in the different actors regarding law enforcement and security. They are key when collecting data for all these processes. And in many cases, we realize that you may lose data, and some cases may not be classified as they should, sometimes because the participants, the actors, do not understand this classification or what is happening. Something else is the updating of data updating. This is not a linear situation. Data can be changing the classification. This is something very clear according to the time, some features for classification. So you have to review that. As I said before, these regional exercises have certain limitations because each country has its own way of collecting that data. And this has enabled us to think about other ways of interchanging, or at the least of proposing that there are ways to exchange data that are workable. It's not just a PDF or just an image or a scan or scan over another image once a year. We have to, beyond all this, even if we achieve a standard, get to a standard, we can do other improvements that by the end of the day will allow us to know more about the situation. So in this sense, we have to think about developing technologies, how this can help in all these exercises. I will not talk about this because Catherine will talk about that and some other crazy things that we are thinking about with her team, as well as with Elena, so I will not talk about it. So basically, just to conclude, and yes, really to conclude, is to make it clear that for us, we know that standardization process do not resolve all these situations regarding feminicide, but it's a key situation, it's a key element to understand and think about political policies, different tools, and things that allow us to get to a better solution of the problem. It's an element that is not enough, but is necessary. We think that things must be seen, whether they are problems, if they are groups of the populations, people, in many cases, what you don't tell is not seen. So if you don't see that, there's no possibility or not many possibilities of having political policies. So we know this is another great effort, is not the solution, but we think it's necessary to do it in order to think about the solutions. So now I've talked for a long time.
Yes, we're going to move on to the second presentation. It's Saida Mujawed. She's a PhD candidate in sociology at the University of Cambridge. In her thesis, she analyzes how feminicide data are collected, represented, and how they are represented and globally acknowledged. Mexico is a specific case study, particularly with regard to how digital activism challenges official feminicide data. Saida is also part of the platform Feminicide Watch from the United Nations Studies Association. She will present the challenges of measuring, comparing, and standardizing feminicide global data. Saida, you may begin. First of all, I want to thank the organizers, Elena, Catherine, and Silvana, the panelists, and everybody joining us today. I cannot express my gratitude and my enthusiasm but I'm deeply honored and very happy to be part of this event. As Angeles said, I'm in my second year in my PhD in sociology, and I believe that it's important that I have to mention the approach from where I approach data with a feminist perspective and anti-colonialist perspective. So I approach many of the points that Silvana mentioned, but maybe from a different perspective, perhaps a bit more theoretical. Uh, First of all, what we want to do is to bring to the table the different elements that come together in the recollection, counting, comparison, standardization, and measuring of feminicide data. This is a transnational scene. I'm talking about the challenges and the frictions around this. And I compare global and regional data with local or national data. In this case, I'm focusing on Mexico and on data and reports from civil society and digital activism activists. I believe it's important to analyze how feminicide is being constructed from these international spaces, because this is where the legal frameworks are set and where they are reproduced about how to count and what to count, and also because they give validity. They make we have institutions which may be weak. Okay, so the first thing, feminicide goes global, or as I say, I'm going to be very brief because this is a thesis in itself, but for the last 30 years, the expansion of the concept of feminicide has been exponential, has grown exponentially. Just, we have a chart on the left, and you have, this is document from the United Nations, and to the right, you have a very basic, it's a search in Google. When someone searches for the term feminicide from 2004 to 2019, as you can see, the growth has been exponential. The second one, this setting the scene that I want to discuss today, we need global data feminicide. As Sally Engelmary mentions, the seductions of quantification. Listing is a relational process that allows us to compare and to make equal something that is different. It leads us to measure, to value, to order, to prioritize, to represent and simplify complex phenomena into numbers. I'm following Desbessier and God, who claim that quantifying is a technical practice, as Silvana said, insofar as it implies measuring, but it's also a social practice because it implies the comparison and agreements and conventions about what to measure and what to standardize. And this is where it becomes key to pay special attention to the methodologies behind what and how we quantify in order to understand power dynamics, which sometimes have a root in inequalities, social political inequalities. As Silvana also mentioned, that is who is counting and how they are counting, that counts. What are the narratives about feminicide that are privilege over others? What remains invisible when we compare, when we realize transnational comparisons from feminicide? Or as we can see, something, these fast facts that we hear in Mexico every day, 10 women die every day in Mexico. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the expansion of the concept and this categorization of feminicide began to influence global statistics as of 2006, when the UN developed the indicators to measure violence against women. It's very important to analyze what is being said about those indicators. To this day, Latin America is the only continent that classifies feminicide as a legal, as a statistical category. And particularly the ECLAC. And this is related to this idea of governance through indicators. And I follow the work of Engelmary when she says that indicators are technology of knowledge that depend on processes of translation and measuring. And this process of translation equalizes the populations and practices and thus deprive them completely of context. So the CLAC uses 3 indicators to compare feminicide in the region, which are intentional murders of women, feminicide, and intimate feminicide. The chart that you can see now is a screenshot of the most recent report from the CLAC, 2019. And you see that, for example, 10 countries only provide figures of women killed by the hands of their partners or former partners, that is intimate feminicide. And this institution acknowledges the problem with this, as what Silvana mentioned as well. Now we're going to move on to the global framework. So the United Nations Office Against Drugs and Crime created this report in 2018. This was the first global study. It only counts feminicide in the context of a romantic couple. And throughout the interviews and when I was preparing my work, I noticed that specialists are always this tension between either working with what we have, which is the figures provided by states and governments, or just not moving forward. So the problem that we have is that the data that governments, we need them to be classified, and we need to know who was the perpetrator, who was the victim. And in many countries, this is impossible, especially in countries where there are weak institutions or there's corruption. For example, it's one of the quotes where they acknowledge that the data they are including are just intimate partner feminicides, where there is a clear relationship between the victim and the perpetrator. It's a bit hard to do this, to talk and to switch the slides at the same time. I agree. Okay, so for the third part, well, the numbers don't add up. What happens when the numbers don't add up? So I'm going to zoom on Mexico now. I talked about it as transnational phenomenon, feminicide, but I'm doing this regional global tour, and now I'm going to focus specifically on Mexico and on the current situation in our country. To put the situation in context, is a situation of violence in Mexico is very difficult and it cannot be done in 10 minutes, especially after in 2006, the war on drugs was declared, and as of then, and increasingly after that, the country has become more militarized. For example, this infographic that you have to the left, this represents very clearly the specific case of Mexico, how these frictions operate between the different organizations and entities that produce data on feminicide. We have, on one hand, the numbers of the National Statistics Institute, and then from the public security system, and then we have the work of activists such as Maria Salguero, Frida Guerrero. So one wonders, well, who should we believe? And this is when I look to Data Cívica. I think that one of their members are here joining us today. This organization produced a very important document published last year, standing well. Also, given this militarization due to the war on drugs, it is also appeared in the public space, and also there's an increase in the use of firearms. So this chart that we present here, the Data Cívica, they show this increase of violence in the public space, which is the red line you can see there. And now Maria Salguero has similar data with regard to violence against women in the public space and the use of firearms in Mexico. And the interesting thing from her data, and I think that this is data that we have to consider, is that she includes the narrative of organized crime in violence. For example, if we see this chart that she has recently shown, see how violence in organized crime has increased, and also has new categories like extrajudicial executions. With regard to perpetrators, many are unknown or hitmen. This is based on her database. And we also see the way in which these women die in Mexico, and that is changing as well. It follows a global narrative, a lot of gunshot wounds, and Maria Salguero acknowledges this. These data come from the press, which means that many of the feminicides, the intimate feminicides, don't make it to the press, so that's important to consider as well. Another key point in Mexico, and in order to understand problem of counting feminicide in this country is that each state has a different idea of what based on gender means. So these entities don't have the same criteria on feminicide. I'm getting there. I'm almost done. So finally, is what did we learn and where do we want to go now? Where are we heading now? I have just 5 key points. The first one, which is something mentioned, documentation of feminicide. We need a context. It's important that we work with and from civil, that began with civil society. So it's civil society that has to tackle and produce and monitor the production of indicators. And another key is that maybe it's time with Elena Suarez-Val. She's an activist, a researcher, a social communication specialist focused on human rights and feminism. She currently works independently. She used to work in Amnesty International, the Global Call to Action Against Poverty, the feminist collective from Uruguay, Cotidiana Mujer. She holds a Master's of Arts in Gender, Media and Culture from Goldsmith, and she's currently on a PhD program at the Center of Interdisciplinary Methodologies from the University of Warwick. Every week you can hear her at the news podcast, feminist news podcast, Never on a Sunday with Elena Fonseca. She's creator and founder of Feminicide Uruguay, which maps feminicides in Uruguay since 2015. She's presenting data frames of feminicide. Elena, you may begin.
Thank you so much, everyone, for these interesting presentations. Silvana talked about globalization and standardization, and I will go specifically to something local, and I will talk about something to think over from the practice, how we get together all the database on feminicide. And I'm going to talk about a work that I did last year, an analysis on these 2 cases, the women killed on gender basis. One is an ontologic reconstruction that I used. Sorry, it's very difficult to talk and use the slides. So I use the data set from Feminicide Uruguay. It's a database that I'm doing since 2015, and something published by the Homeland of Uruguay, Ministry of Uruguay. The theoretical framework tried to approach the feminicide term and think about the frameworks as how a category gives the frame not only what we look for, but also what we see. I'm going to skip over the theoretical approach. So then we will share the presentations if the other people authorize so. Another thing to think about this theoretical framework for feminicide is the idea there are some digital traces of the murder. How the cases of women killed because of gender and others because of violence have been important through different media. For example, the one that I do the monitoring in these things, and I try to find the traces about information, details about the case, so that I can use this theoretical category to finally create the data framework. And this idea is specifically related to the charts that present this information. I talk about charts because this is how I present the information, but it's an idea that enables us to think about different digital traces of murder are organized or presented in different ways in data frameworks with different shapes. So the methodology, as I said, is an ontologic reconstruction. And for this methodology, what this it implies, and it's important to share it with you, especially about these people that were making this database, to go a step backwards and think how we can reconstruct the ontologic part of data. All of us who work with database, we know that one of the first things is to build the ontologic aspect of data, how we're going to shape all these, the names, in which order for the different things. So this data ontology, we do it from the theoretical knowledge and our experience and what we are trying to convey, in this case, feminicide. So one of the questions is, from a chart, is it possible to reconstruct all that category? Anyone is able to reconstruct all this through the chart on the net and get all the information that goes backwards behind all that chart and get to the information that we did in our case. So women killed because of their gender. So this is one of the questions. Up to which point, how we present data, and this presentation of the data gives a reference to the people that see them, how they understand, how they can understand all the information, all the background information. As I said, Data Feminicide Uruguay and another data published in 2019 called Homicides of Women, something is broader related to gender. It's very important to let you know that when I carried out this, the Homeland Ministry had published certain data, but it didn't include feminicide. That database only included several charts, and one of them was called Home Murders for Women. In 2018, there was a special chart for feminicide, and this is quite interesting. I will let you know later why. So this is the database for feminicide in Uruguay. Basically, the work for the ontologic reconstruction is to work to see all the work. This is how I presented the chart in a website with a description, with a certain order of the columns, several hashtags, everything within a frame that goes beyond the data framework specifically, but also calls attention to those looking at this data set with certain categories and certain definitions regarding feminicide. Here you can see how it's deploy the information from the Homeland Ministry, open data from the ministry, the Uruguay government. There were several data centers, data sets. You can see homicides, and now we have feminicide. Columns in that database didn't include the murders, and the analysis is quite similar. Framework for Feminicide Uruguay is activist, uses category feminicide, and the technical support also, this is very important, is Google Spreadsheets and Google Maps. I also have accounts in social networks, and this enlarges the framework because this database goes from the website and beyond. Here you can see the map. And this is the ontologic reconstruction that I did. as I said before, I can share this work so you can see how you can do this kind of analysis. I'm looking at all these columns, and I could see that within all this data framework, there are different people. There is a murderer there, a feminicide, someone that is not clearly, that's not defined, that has a certain age and a name, and is not defined with a certain role. Then there is an event that is related to different other things like a date. And I can see different actors, but kind of blurry. You have the media because the database includes links to the cases. Then you have the government, and then in the down in the middle, you have departments because it's an administrative division of Uruguay as a country. And then you have previous claims of the cases. It's very interesting to me to do this ontological reconstruction. I realized that I barely use a reference to the gender. It's not explicit, this reference. And this blurs all this side as it's not connected to gender, because it's not connected to inequality in society. The same process for homicides at home, women homicides at home. The work is not so even, and you can see that gender identification is included there in the column there. Women cis, male cis, trans. So the gender identification is something individual. It's not related to the society. So the ontological reconstruction, we can see also that it's very important that the people that are defined as victims of murderers. The columns identify the victim as victim and the murderer as murderer, and you don't have another choice. The conclusion, I think this is a very clear exercise for all of us that work on this, related to violence, or specifically, we can see the structure and the framework of the data and reconstruct from there the classification. And this is something political as well. Another thing is that the description included in this database opens certain kind of actions to go deeper into the action. In case of Feminicide Uruguay, that women are mentioned so you can follow up the legal procedure. Otherwise, if you're anonymous, and this is valid as well, you are not able to follow with any other actions. Feminicide Uruguay also works from the public side. Sometimes we have participated with signs related to the situation. How you can, the digital links can be followed, and how they are in the framework, and they enable to understand the definition of feminicide and take certain actions. The suggestions, in order to conclude, I think it's important to make it more evident all these situations of a categorical framework. If you enclose the victim and the murderer, and you don't let the state in the gender definitions, the categories must be defined, their social relationship, how they work, I said, how you see the web of connections. And finally, something that is very pragmatic and very important, and it has to do with the standardization protocol that said Hilda, and it's included. Not in the case of the government, they don't include race and other dimensions that have interconnections, in this case in Uruguay. So thank you so much.
Thank you for your presentation, Elena. We have many questions. We won't be able to answer all of them. Some of them have been already answered during the presentations. I'm going to choose two questions. One is for Saide and the other one is for Elena. I'm going to answer the others through the Q&A module for Saide. How can we approach a better way of measuring feminicide, for example, intimate feminicide, if we don't have the necessary data? In Mexico, over 90% of documents when a person dies do not record the relationship, the family relationship between the perpetrator and victim. So how can we count? While you think about your answer, Elena, the victim and the data is determined. Aida, you can begin.
I think that this is the one we do it to have it in question. This is quite weak, as I said in the presentation.
En realidad, cuando reparamos en la complejidad de tener un cuerpo sin vida a convertirse en un dato de feminicidio, es impresionante. O sea, la cantidad de manos, de procesos, de burocracia, de formas que se tienen que llenar, son miles. Entonces, uno de los grandes problemas que yo he encontrado en mi investigación ha sido la categoría de género y la dificultad de operacionalizar el género como estadística. Y cómo das a entender que esta mujer murió por ser mujer, ¿no? por tener esta identidad. Entonces ahí ese es uno de los problemas que también se ha debatido mucho en la definición del feminicidio. Y la otra que se puede hacer y que es importante es mirar cómo las activistas están impugnando estos datos. Yo creo que María Salguero ofrece una narrativa interesante. Si bien no hay ni el INEGI, ni el secretario ejecutivo, ni María Salguero, nadie nos puede ofrecer una cifra concreta o certera de cuántos feminicidios están habiendo, pero es importante mirar y hacer comparativos con otras formas de producir conocimiento que van más allá del Estado, porque si algo hemos aprendido del movimiento feminista, sobre todo en Latinoamérica, es que es la sociedad civil quienes ayudan a generar narrativas distintas, no tanto el Estado. Entonces, ya.
Muchas
gracias. Sí. Perdón que no está muy...
¿Otra pregunta?
Gracias por tu pregunta y gracias porque también me ha ayudado mucho a pensar.
It's also been very useful for me to think about how feminicide works as a category, and the answer is, I think it's because the ministry, the data that they produce, they publish this metadata where they explain each column and how they consider each column. Gender appears as what they report about gender identity, what neighbors and friends say about gender identity. So I think that's very interesting because the ministry is using a very social understanding of gender, because it's not sex, it's gender as reported by this person's acquaintances. And the team of the ministry is doing good work, given the limitations of working within these legal definitions and these loopholes, like including gender identity. I think that is also very interesting, and maybe someone from the ministry might be here. Their work is very interesting, as I said, trying to sort out, to fit in this machine of the state, to include concepts which are still relatively new. Thank you very much, Elena. We're going to move on to the second part of the webinar. We have 3 presentations. The other questions, the panelists will reply to the questions through the Q&A module. So some comments, we had many questions about the presentations and the information that we have been presenting after the event. Oh, this has been recorded, so we will put the information on YouTube next week.
for all the questions related to these presentations and the videos. So let's continue with the second block, second part. We begin with Diana Galvis. She's a politologist and a history in digital humanities. She's researcher in open government, data sketch, and she's the leader of contents on data and creation of a database focusing on anti-corruption, gender, human rights, among others. Mariana Villamizar, she's the leader of design for data visualization, information, and web design at Data Sketch. She's also an engineer. She works on women. And they will be in the seminars. Now you can begin.
Hello, everyone. Very
tratar de promover eso a los datos en una interacción con la ciudadanía. Entonces, pues contándoles un panorama de la vida de género en Colombia, pues existe una ley
law 1761 from 2015, which considers feminicide as crimes in themselves, and they ensure the investigation and a record of the cases of feminicide in the country. What happens in reality is that the information records are specific
sentencias hacia los mismos
for perpetrators of perpetrators of the crimes and not the real cases. So who commits the crime can escape, can leave the country, or the relatives, maybe the victim's relatives won't report. And for many reasons, there is an under-reporting in the official records. What we do from Data Sketch is our approach has two levels regarding based violence. First, we collect this non-existent data because they are evidence for a political debate on gender violence, and also to measure the progress or the regression in terms of women's rights. So we don't have data, we can't debate, and so we can't measure. And the second approach, the way we deal with this issue, is trying to make visible testimonies of the victims, and we do that because many of these projects privilege the technical analysis of data, and they forget the knowledge that comes from the experience of the victims and their families. And many times, as we're going to see later on, it's this experience rather than the data what explains the dynamics of gender violence in Colombia and in other countries as well. And that also, we're going to see that data also explains the lack of this data, and also because it's essential to go to those who have the experience and give shape to, not testimonies of maybe a neighbor who said the victim liked to go out into political debate, but does affect the situation and ends up silencing the victims and their families. Well, now projects we have been promoting from
la acción
with we did this in collaboration with conscientious objectors, and the idea was to reflect what happens when women are romantically involved with members of law enforcement. They experience violence, gender violence, in a different way. Can you change the slide, please? So in this project, we also had to gather data, non-existent data, or our approach was to use the data that we had that would, in a way, offer some clues. So we used a database from legal medicine and one from the prosecution. They include the reports, the cases that have been reported, but as we will see, to report in this context is usually very difficult. We had another database from the Department of Women here in Bogota, and this did not include the need for a report, but there was no classification whether the perpetrator was a member of law enforcement or not, only if they carried a weapon. So that's the data that we had to work with. When we compared these databases with the testimony of the women, what we realized was that it's very difficult for them to officially report these cases, because those who have called for help, well, it's the police, the one that responds, and of course there's this code of loyalty. So what happens is the women are not protected. Another way in which we gather non-existent data is to revise the news reports in which situations were discussed, including gender-based violence from men in law enforcement, and we found this patriarchal of the fact, the event, the stigmatization of the victims, and usually was given to work with the perpetrator, which in a way would whitewash what they did, or the other explanation was that this was just one bad apple, but not representative of the reality. Yes, I'm about to finish. The way in which we give visibility to the testimonies of the victims, which is the main part of our project, was we include audio files in the specials, in which the victim itself, in some cases, tell the story, and sometimes the family, because unfortunately the victim had been murdered. And what we realized is that the rotation they have to do going from place to place, when they follow their husbands all over the country, they lose contact with their families and support networks, which makes it more difficult for them to ask for help. And also that military and enforcement institutions have created the family military police station, but it's the same institution that runs these things. So they cover up the cases so they don't come to light. And again, of course, as I said, the interaction between the victim and perpetrator is always mediated by a gun, because they are always carrying weapons. So it's very difficult to escape those power dynamics for these women. And well, we weren't able to show the specials, but we're going to put the links in the Q&A so you can check them out. And that will be, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mariana and Juliana, for the work you've been doing in Colombia. We're going to move on to the next presentation. Catherine Ignacio. Catherine is an artist, social director in the US, focused on feminism and data. She directs the Data plus Feminism Lab at MIT. Ignacio is known for her hackathons, like Make the Breast Pump, Not Suck, and her book, Data Feminism. She will present her work co-designing artificial intelligence tools to detect feminicide and data gathering. Thank you. And you may begin.
Well, thank you so much, Angeles. It's a great pleasure to be with you here. Today I'm going to talk about a work in cooperation with my lab and MIT, is that Data Plus Feminism Lab with Hilda and Feminicidio Uruguay. And many students, most of them participating today. I added in the chat some links. So different versions, there's an English version and another one in Spanish. If you want to follow it up, I'm sorry that I don't speak Portuguese, so I couldn't do a Portuguese version. So first, in our recent book, called Data Feminism. We analyzed feminicides as case of missing data, and data not collected by the state. Those that were collected are very poor quality. Activist monitoring of feminicides that are participating today represent a way to challenge the missing data, and they are a powerful example for feminist counterdata collection. Nevertheless, as many of you know, activists face many challenges when collecting data on feminicide. And this leads us to our question in our research regarding with the social technical feature. Which are the ways in which artificial intelligence and machine learning can support and sustain the civil society efforts? We need the social society as a transparency method in order to collect this data on feminicides, and we can use it as a cooperation. First, we want to understand how these feminist groups collect the data on these. So we have a list of all the groups that we can find that were working on data collection on this work. At present, we have over 40 projects on this list and in different countries. Most of them are located in Latin America, where feminist movements have done so much work to put feminicide on the public agenda. But there are many efforts from many other locations around the world. Some of them monitor specific cases, intersectional feminicide, like sovereign bodies in the US. And they monitor indigenous women that are missing and were murdered, or Data Lab in Brazil, which monitors transgender violence. So in order to understand the similarities, differences, and technological needs of these groups, we undertook a quality research and participatory design sessions. We carried out 10 meetings with activists that work with all these collection data, and they were conducted in the Americas and also in Spain. And we asked them about their motivations, definitions, categories, and their process for collecting cases, and their kind of work, including their emotional labor. We worked very closely with two of these efforts, Feminicidio Uruguay, Elena, and Women Count USA, which is based in US. They participated with us in technology co-design sessions. And based on this, we have written a document that describes our findings. We grouped activists' information in 3 groups: research, the act of searching and finding cases of feminicides, recording, and which shows how activists move from one information source to log the cases in their database, and finally, remembering the importance of memorialization of the data practices of activists. This paper is being reviewed, but it's not published yet, but we can give you access to one of the copies if you send us an email. Well, in this study, we found certain patterns related with challenges, data collection. We have a lot. Well, many people have talked about missing data that is not available. Official records are inadequate, not available, non-existent. Then there is a bias relating to media. Some activists use media to collect the information related to the bias of the media themselves. The media tend to be sexist, transphobic, and racist. And quite often they don't give out information relating to the tribes or race, or they do it with a bias. In many cases, they use alerts and they use this for groups, but sometimes it's not very relevant. So a lot of information to be checked in order to get really information. Then you have capacity challenges. Most of them have these kind of challenges. Time is scarce. Most efforts are volunteer based. Learning digital tools takes time, and the requests of public information are very expensive. And finally, there is a great emotional label carried out by activists regarding to violence and death. And this is a very heavy work. Some groups work directly with the families, and that it carries out a lot of emotion. In some cases, they have to face the exhaustion due to all this labor. So from this, in the research, we are working on two tools in order to help them in their work. The first one, okay, 2 minutes, sorry. 3 minutes, good. The first tool is a highlighting of news and help the activists to understand the news
most populated area in the Republic. It's a place with great heterogeneity, as you can see in the map. This shows the marginalization exclusion indexes. There are different economic variables. As you can see, there's the state of Mexico, then you have the federal district, what used to be called federal district, now it's called Mexico City. And as we get near to the city, we see these levels. Another characteristic is that there's this belt surrounding the north of the city, which are called bedroom cities. The idea is that there aren't many work opportunities there, so people have to commute long journeys to the capital in order to be able to study or to work. And there's a great book about this, about the coexistence between this and feminicide, which is called The Water Pit by Lidia Carrion. And it talks about the municipality of Tecamac. Another characteristic of the state of Mexico is that it has been governed by the same party for over 100 years. And so it's very difficult to have feminicide acknowledged as a problem. The current governor, Alfredo Armaza, only acknowledges 299 feminicide, and official figures include 1,258 cases filed for intentional homicide against women during the same period. So what is the alternative? Well, the data on feminism in Mexico exists. I've mentioned, as Maria had mentioned earlier, problems that they have. Feminicide is present in all the criminal codes in the state and the federal criminal code. But the problem is in how this is interpreted, how feminicide is interpreted, how each prosecution office records those data. And that's a problem because the figures are not clear. It's difficult to compare them. It's very difficult to make them operative. So these databases that come from the state prosecutions are the data from the national system, from the public sector national system. And these figures also have a problem of under-reporting, a serious. Then there's data from the INEGI, the Institute of National Statistics, but those have a delay of a year. So in order to understand the data, so the solution, as Catherine mentioned, the solution is counter data, non-data. So we gather other data. And part of that, one of those alternatives comes from Maria Salguero. She has recorded feminicide. So what Maria does is that she reads the papers, and based on the information that she gathers there, she classifies and then georeferences the place where the feminicide took place. So of course, there's a great discrepancy between official figures and what Maria has done. In 2018, the discrepancy was about 80 or 60. And now it's 393 feminicides reported by Maria, and 231 according to official figures. That's for the years 2018 and 2019. So how can we find patterns? Well, we can use data visualization. This is a map, 2018 and 2019, with georeference. And you can see above Mexico City, you have a concentration of feminicides. Another way we can see this is with the National Statistics Institute of Mexico. They have a criteria, a more loose criteria. It includes a criterion of population, but also if the place is residential or commercial, or 68% of feminicides in those places were located in those urban areas. So this indicates that this phenomenon, at least in this place, is an urban phenomenon. Another way of looking at this is through correlates and hotspots. We have the correlate to the left, and there on the right we see the darker area. The hotspots plot doesn't have georeferencing just as clear, but we can see that the areas surrounding Mexico City at the north, those would be like the red, the hotspots. So it's important to ask whether these patterns are random, or another way of asking that is if they are statistically significant. So one way of quantifying these patterns is resorting to the definition of what is called spatial dependency. It has to do with locations close locations influence each other and have similar attributes. So that leads us to think that it could be possible that some places are catalysts of feminicide, and one way of measuring that is through spatial autocorrelation. For this work, I used Moran's I Global, which is a number, an index. In this case, it was positive, and it's very important, which means that there is a concentration at some point in the state of Mexico and the local one. And we have these maps that you can see on the screen, and they show the areas that are more significant. And again, we see that the areas surrounding the capital, surrounding Mexico City in the north, include places like, for example, Ecatepec, Teneplan, and other locations. Another way of looking at this is measuring the distance between feminicides. I use the algorithm of neighbors, close neighbors, and I noticed that the distance was 24 kilometers and the minimum distance was less than a meter. So this, Maria told me that these results, this might be explained because these two feminicides occurred at the same place, at the same time. So we can see that feminicides are concentrated. If you see at the screen, at the top screen, we have this correlation between the events and the distance. And you can see that as the distance are smaller, there is a positive correlation to feminicide. And as distances grow longer, the correlation tends to zero. Another way to see this and to associate this with socioeconomic measures is through a weighted geographic regression system. So we associate geographically the variables. And here you can see the relation between population and feminicide was a positive correlation in the map of the state of Mexico. The darker colors reflect the dynamics of this relation. You can see that when closer to the Mexico City. Then I also did it with income, per capita income. And you can see as gradually as you approach the city of Mexico, this relation increases, this positive relation increases, which is counterintuitive because the idea is one would think that places with higher income would have less feminicide, but it's not the case. But I also did it with poverty. In places there's less poverty, there's more feminicides. This map is a bit more, has more heterogeneity, but it's still interesting because places where people are doing relatively well in terms of there's no poverty, we still have higher feminicide figures. I also did it with the criterion of the lack of access to services in the home, and it's the opposite relationship. When as this diminishes, feminicides increase, and the magnitude is not as important in the area that we've been analyzing to be significant. And finally, I also dealt with the quality, housing quality and the space. And again, to sum up, these are counterintuitive results. The literature, somebody analyzed how New Mexico found a positive relation between poverty and feminicide in Mexico, but this is not the case. At least in the state of Mexico, everything indicates that it's an urban phenomenon without relative access to goods and services, but they're doing relatively well compared to people in other places. So it seems to be happening in places with relatively high incomes. This highlights the importance of regional analysis and of data, including georeferencing. And that is all. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Fernanda. This concludes the second part. we want to remind you that there is a directory that is being shared in the chat. And the second session next week will be, you will have more participation than today. Now, Catherine and Elena, I don't know who goes first in order to conclude today's session. Okay.
Las dos a la vez, un corito.
Both at the same time. Okay, okay. Elena, first. I'm going first. We have 15 more minutes just to conclude the session. Thank you for all the questions that you sent. You can see and read them in the Q&A. You can get in touch with us through the mail datos@gmail.com. Just to let you know that this is just the beginning. It's very interesting how everything is related. One subject is related to the other, how we see and how we understand data at a global level and the standardizations, just to share all these global data, how we analyze the detail and the works from activists, and the real work of using all that information. So Fernanda, thank you so much for this analysis. It was very interesting how from this data generated from activists we can make some very interesting analysis and to understand the situation. And of course, the presentations from the Colombian participants, how we find a more human way to analyze data and going beyond data, just not to be with the cold figures and having this quantification and questions. So the last project is the cooperation with Catherine and Silvana, presented by Catherine, automatization of data in media. It was very interesting, and many people said are interested to participate in the pilot project. Catherine, anything?
No, just to thank everyone for coming. Just a comment. People are asking, well, how to contact you for the project. Maybe you can include in your email from Data Plus Feminism in the chat window, so they can contact you. Yes, I'm gonna do that. Angelis is doing that right now. I just want to thank you all for coming. I'm really impressed that we are like approaching this issue from many different perspectives. I'm surprised at how many different participants, the government, the state, the media, the activists, civil society. To me, we have to build these bridges, to connect with each other through these bridges in order to work on this. So I'm very happy to see all the work that you've been doing and all the people who have joined us. We are very excited to see about what we're going to do next week in the more interactive sessions, because one of our goals for this event is to help you connect, among each other, and that is what we're going to be doing. It involves more solidarity and all the good work that you've been doing on this issue. Sometimes it's difficult to stay in touch. So we'll meet again. So that was all. Just collect your energy for next week, because it has been intense. Today it was just, we did all the work, we did all the talking, but you won't hear us. It's your turn. It will be your turn next time. So rest, get ready, and we'll see you next week.